At 6:17 on the morning of October 3rd, 1944, Corporal Ivan Sidorenko lay in a shell crater 320 yards from German lines outside Vitebsk, watching his world end in fragments. The Mosin-Nagant rifle across his lap had a scope with a crack running diagonally through the front lens. His left eye was swollen shut from shrapnel. His right hand shook from blood loss. And 5 German officers were about to walk into what remained of his kill zone. 33 years old, 287 confirmed kills, 0 chance of survival if he missed. The German artillery barrage had caught Sidorenko's spotter team at 4:30, 3 hours before dawn. They'd been occupying an observation post in a collapsed barn, 400 yards behind Soviet lines. Standard sniper protocol. 2 men, 1 rifle, 48 hours of continuous observation. His spotter, Junior Sergeant Mikhail Ivankov, had been asleep when the first shells hit. 22 years old. Farm boy from outside Kursk. 4 months in the sniper company. The barn's roof had come down in one piece. Sidorenko had dragged Ivankov's body out of the rubble at 5:15. Ivankov's neck was broken. His eyes were still open. Sidorenko had checked his rifle by feel in the darkness. The stock was intact. The bolt moved smoothly. But when he'd raised the scope to his eye, he'd seen the crack. A single diagonal fracture running from upper left to lower right across the front objective lens. The glass hadn't shattered completely, but the crack split his sight picture into 2 overlapping images. Everything he saw through the scope appeared doubled, offset by maybe 2 inches at 100 yards. A cracked scope meant the rifle was useless for precision work. Standard procedure was to return to the armory, requisition a replacement scope, re-zero the weapon. That process took 6 hours minimum. Sidorenko didn't have 6 hours. German forces were preparing a counterattack. Soviet intelligence had identified a command group coordinating the assault from a farmhouse 300 yards west of the current front line. 5 officers, probably battalion level or higher. Taking them out before the attack began could disrupt German coordination, save Soviet lives. Sidorenko's company commander had given him the mission at 5:45. Captain Volkov had looked at the cracked scope, looked at Sidorenko's swollen eye, and asked if he could still shoot. Sidorenko had said yes, without hesitation. He'd been lying. He had no idea if he could compensate for the double image in his scope. No idea if his damaged eye would hold up under recoil. No idea if his shaking hands would steady enough for a 300-yard shot. But Ivankov was dead, and someone had to take the shot. Volkov had sent him forward alone. No spotter, no backup. Every other sniper in the company was already deployed. Sidorenko would have 1 chance. 5 targets, probably 5 shots. If he missed, the officers would scatter, and the opportunity would disappear. He'd crawled to the shell crater at 6 a.m., moving through pre-dawn darkness across no man's land. The crater was fresh, maybe 2 days old. Still smelled like cordite and churned earth. It offered a clear line of sight to the German farmhouse and just enough depth to hide a prone shooter. Now the sun was coming up, and Sidorenko could see the farmhouse clearly. 2 stories, white plaster walls, red tile roof. The eastern wall faced Soviet positions. 3 windows on the ground floor, 2 on the second floor. Officers would use the second floor for observation. Higher vantage point, better field of view. Sidorenko raised his rifle and looked through the cracked scope. The double image made his head hurt. The farmhouse appeared twice, overlapped, separated by maybe 6 inches in his sight picture. He lowered the rifle and closed his eyes. His left eye throbbed. He could feel dried blood on his cheek, where shrapnel had torn the skin. If you want to see how Sidorenko adjusted for a broken scope and dropped 5 officers with 5 shots, hit that like button right now. Every like helps us share these forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Sidorenko. The crack in his scope wasn't random. It ran at a precise angle, upper left to lower right, exactly 45 degrees from horizontal. Sidorenko had measured it by eye during his crawl to the crater. 45 degrees meant the displacement was consistent and predictable. If he could calculate how much the crack offset his point of aim, he could compensate. He'd tested the scope during training exercises in 1942. Not with a cracked lens, but with deliberate sight picture modifications. The Red Army Sniper School at Podolsk had taught advanced compensation techniques for damaged equipment. Bent scopes, loose mounts, cracked lenses, wore damaged equipment constantly. Snipers who couldn't adapt didn't survive. The key was understanding geometry. A crack created 2 overlapping images because light refracted differently through damaged glass. The crack acted like a prism, splitting the image. The offset depended on crack angle, glass thickness, and distance to target. At 300 yards, with a 45-degree crack in the front objective lens, Sidorenko estimated the offset would be approximately 8 inches. That meant if he aimed at a target's center mass, the bullet would impact 8 inches to the left and 8 inches low. Simple mathematics. Brutal application. He needed to verify the offset before shooting at officers. A test shot would give him precise data, but a test shot would also alert every German in the farmhouse that a sniper was active. He'd lose the element of surprise. The officers would disappear. The mission would fail. Sidorenko decided to shoot without testing. Pure calculated risk based on training and experience. He'd compensate by aiming 8 inches high and 8 inches right of his intended point of impact. If his math was correct, the bullet would hit center mass. If his math was wrong, he'd miss, and 5 German officers would organize an attack that would kill Soviet soldiers. At 6:28, the first officer appeared in the second-floor window. Sidorenko watched him through the cracked scope. German Army uniform, field gray. Shoulder boards indicated major, maybe Oberstleutnant. The officer was holding binoculars, scanning Soviet positions. He stood in the window for maybe 15 seconds, then stepped back into shadow. Sidorenko didn't shoot. The target was too exposed, too obvious. If this officer was important enough to warrant assassination, he'd return to the window. Patient snipers survived. Impatient snipers got themselves killed trying to force shots that weren't ready. At 6:31, 2 more officers appeared in the same window. One was definitely Oberstleutnant. The other looked like Hauptmann. Both men were examining maps, pointing at Soviet positions, discussing something. They stayed in the window longer this time, maybe 30 seconds. Sidorenko centered his crosshairs on the Oberstleutnant's chest, calculated his compensation, and waited. Not yet. He needed all 5 targets identified before he started shooting. At 6:34, the window filled with officers. 5 men total, crowded together, looking at something outside Sidorenko's sight line. This was the shot. All 5 targets in one location, close enough that he could transition between them rapidly. If he worked fast and shot accurately, he could drop all 5 before they scattered. Sidorenko's right hand steadied. The shaking stopped. Some biological switch flipped in his brain, the same switch that flipped every time he prepared to kill. His breathing slowed. His heart rate dropped. His vision narrowed until nothing existed except the scope, the targets, and the mathematics of death. He placed his crosshairs on the Oberstleutnant, the tallest officer, standing in the center of the group. Using the cracked scope, Sidorenko could see two versions of this man, offset diagonally. He ignored the false image and focused on the primary image, the one his experience told him was real. Then he shifted his point of aim, 8 inches right and 8 inches high, compensating for the crack displacement. The Oberstleutnant's chest filled his sight picture. Sidorenko exhaled slowly, let half his breath out, held the rest. His finger took up slack on the trigger. The Mosin-Nagant's trigger pull was 5 pounds, smooth and predictable. He'd fired this rifle 1,347 times. He knew exactly when the sear would release. The rifle fired. Recoil punched his shoulder. Through the scope, Sidorenko saw the Oberstleutnant's head snap back. The officer dropped out of sight. Direct hit, center mass, exactly where Sidorenko had intended, despite the cracked scope. His mathematics had been correct. The other 4 officers froze for maybe half a second. That critical moment of confusion when the brain tries to process unexpected violence. Sidorenko used that half second. He worked the bolt, chambered another round, and shifted to the second target before the first officer hit the floor. Hauptmann, shorter than the Oberstleutnant, standing to the left. Sidorenko compensated again, 8 inches right and high. Fired. The Hauptmann collapsed. 2 down. The remaining 3 officers scattered. Training and survival instinct overrode shock. They dove away from the window, disappearing into the farmhouse interior. Sidorenko had maybe 3 seconds before they evacuated the building completely. 3 seconds to find and kill 3 men who were actively trying to survive. He shifted to the left window on the second floor. Empty. Shifted to the right window. Movement in shadow. 1 officer crouched below the windowsill, trying to stay low while moving towards the door. Sidorenko could see just the top of his head and shoulders, maybe 6 inches of target. Difficult shot, but possible. He aimed high, compensated for the crack, and fired. The officer's head disappeared in a spray of red. 3 down. The bolt felt hot in his hand as he chambered the 4th round. Sidorenko shifted back to the center window. The 2 remaining officers were gone. He lowered his scope, scanning the ground floor windows. Nothing. They'd either evacuated the building or moved to interior rooms without windows. Then he saw movement in the ground floor doorway. 1 officer sprinting toward a communications trench 20 yards from the farmhouse. German lieutenant, running hard, head down. Sidorenko tracked him, led the target by 2 feet to account for movement, compensated for the crack, and fired. The lieutenant stumbled, fell, didn't get up. 4 down. The 5th officer appeared in the doorway, saw his dead companion, and ran the opposite direction toward a vehicle parked behind the farmhouse. Sidorenko lost sight of him behind the building's corner. He shifted his aim to the vehicle, a Kubelwagen, German equivalent of a jeep. The officer would have to approach the vehicle from the farmhouse side, would be exposed for maybe 2 seconds while opening the door and climbing in. Sidorenko waited. His bolt was already open, his 5th round chambered. His eye hurt. The swelling was getting worse, narrowing his field of vision. His right hand had started shaking again, blood loss catching up to him. He could feel warm wetness soaking through his bandage. The 5th officer appeared, running toward the Kubelwagen. Older man, probably major or Oberstleutnant. He reached the vehicle, grabbed the door handle. Sidorenko placed his crosshairs on the man's torso, compensated 8 inches, and fired. The officer collapsed against the vehicle's side. 5 shots, 5 officers down. Mission complete. Sidorenko worked the bolt one more time, ejecting the empty casing, but didn't chamber another round. His ammunition was precious. Every round had to count. He lowered the rifle and pressed his face against the cold earth at the bottom of the shell crater. His hands were shaking violently now. Adrenaline dump, delayed shock, blood loss. Didn't matter which, he'd completed the mission. German small arms fire erupted from positions near the farmhouse. They'd triangulated his muzzle flash, figured out approximately where he was shooting from. Bullets cracked overhead, impacting the crater's rim. Sidorenko pressed himself flat and didn't move. They were firing blind, suppressive fire meant to keep him pinned while they maneuvered infantry to flank him. He needed to withdraw, but withdrawal in daylight across open ground meant certain death. He'd have to wait for darkness. Another 12 hours minimum. 12 hours in a shell crater with a broken scope, a damaged eye, and Germans hunting him. The mathematics of his survival looked poor. Sidorenko's sniper training had begun in December 1941, 6 months after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. He'd been a school teacher before the war, mathematics and physics, in a small town outside Moscow. When the war started, he'd volunteered for the Red Army. They'd assigned him to an infantry regiment, gave him a Mosin-Nagant rifle, and 6 weeks of basic training. His first combat experience was the defense of Moscow. December 1941, temperatures dropping to -40 degrees. German forces 15 miles from the Kremlin. Sidorenko's regiment had held positions in a frozen forest, trading rifle fire with Wehrmacht infantry across a river valley. He'd killed his first German soldier at 180 yards, standing shot, iron sights. The soldier had been carrying ammunition boxes, walking between positions. Sidorenko had aimed at center mass and fired. The soldier dropped. Sidorenko felt nothing except the need to chamber another round. His company commander noticed his shooting. After 3 days of combat, Sidorenko had 11 confirmed kills, all at ranges exceeding 150 yards. The commander recommended him for sniper school. The Red Army was desperately recruiting snipers. German advances had created a shortage of trained marksmen. Sniper schools were running accelerated courses, graduating students in 8 weeks, instead of the peacetime standard of 6 months. Sidorenko reported to the sniper school at Podolsk in February 1942. The facility was a converted factory complex, crude but functional. Instructors were veteran snipers pulled from active combat, men with 30, 40, 50 confirmed kills. They taught fieldcraft, camouflage, range estimation, wind reading, and most importantly, the psychology of killing at distance. The head instructor was Major Vasily Zaitsev, already famous for his work at Stalingrad. Zaitsev had 149 confirmed kills by the time he arrived at Podolsk. He taught that sniping was 10% marksmanship and 90% patience. A sniper's job wasn't to shoot everything that moved. A sniper's job was to identify high-value targets, wait for the perfect shot, and execute without emotion. Sidorenko absorbed everything. He'd always been good at mathematics, good at breaking complex problems into solvable components. Sniping was applied mathematics. Calculate range, wind deflection, bullet drop, target movement. Factor in variables, solve the equation, press the trigger. Every shot was a math problem. Every kill was a solved equation. He graduated from Podolsk in April 1942, ranked 3rd in his class of 47 students. The Red Army assigned him to the 184th Rifle Division, operating near Smolensk. His first mission, as a qualified sniper, was to eliminate German artillery observers, who were directing fire onto Soviet positions. The observers worked in pairs, positioned in church steeples and tall buildings. They were well protected, alert, and trained to spot countersnipers. Sidorenko spent 4 days observing German patterns before taking his first shot. He identified 3 observer posts, mapped their rotation schedules, calculated the times when they were most exposed. On the 5th day, he shot one observer at 340 yards, head shot through a bell tower window. The Germans replaced him within an hour. Sidorenko shot the replacement at 380 yards. The Germans abandoned that observation post. Over the next 2 weeks, Sidorenko eliminated 9 German observers. Artillery fire on Soviet positions decreased by 60%. His division commander personally commended him. By October 1942, Sidorenko had 43 confirmed kills. By February 1943, 89 kills. By June 1943, 154 kills. He'd survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Dnieper crossings. He'd seen most of his original sniper company killed. New replacements arrived constantly. Young men with 8 weeks of training and no combat experience. Most died within their first month. The survival rate for Soviet snipers was roughly 40%. 6 out of 10 snipers didn't complete their first year of combat. Sidorenko survived because he followed rules. Never shoot from the same position twice. Never establish patterns. Never take unnecessary risks. Never shoot at targets below officer rank unless specifically ordered. High-value targets only. Every bullet had to justify its cost in blood and time. His reputation grew. Other snipers in the division called him the calculator because of his methodical approach. He carried a small notebook where he recorded every shot: date, time, target description, range, wind conditions, result. By October 1944, his notebook contained 287 entries. Every single one documented a confirmed kill. Now he was lying in a shell crater with a cracked scope, a damaged eye, and Germans searching for him. Entry 288 through 292 were recorded, but he might not survive long enough to add them to his notebook. German voices echoed across no man's land. Search teams, probably a squad-sized element, sweeping toward his position. Sidorenko could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their movement. They were being careful, advancing slowly, checking every crater and trench line. Smart tactics. They knew a Soviet sniper was out here. They knew he'd just killed 5 officers. They wanted revenge, and they wanted to capture or kill him before he could withdraw. Sidorenko checked his ammunition. He had 14 rounds remaining in his magazine pouch. His rifle held 5 rounds in the internal magazine, 1 in the chamber. If the Germans found him, he could kill maybe 6 or 7 before they overwhelmed him with superior numbers. Not good odds, but better than surrendering. Soviet snipers didn't surrender. The Germans shot captured snipers on sight. The sun climbed higher. 7:30, then 8 o'clock, then 8:30. The temperature rose. The shell crater offered no shade. Sidorenko's canteen was empty. He'd drunk the last of his water at 5 a.m., before the barrage that killed Ivankov. His mouth tasted like copper and dust. At 9:15, he heard movement close by. Boots crunching on broken earth, maybe 30 yards away. German soldiers, definitely a search team. They were moving methodically, checking every position. Sidorenko pressed himself against the crater's side and didn't breathe. If they looked directly into his crater, they'd see him. His camouflage was good, but not perfect. Dried grass and mud smeared on his uniform. broken branches tied to his rifle. Standard sniper fieldcraft. It worked at 100 yards. At 10 yards, it was inadequate. The footsteps passed. The Germans moved beyond his position, searching further east. Sidorenko exhaled slowly. Close. Too close. But they'd be back. Search patterns meant covering the same ground multiple times from different angles. Eventually, they'd look into his crater from the right direction at the right time, and they'd spot him. He needed to move, but movement in daylight meant exposure. The nearest cover was a destroyed T-34 tank, 80 yards to the south. He could reach it in maybe 45 seconds if he ran. But 45 seconds of exposure across open ground, with German search teams active, meant probable death. The alternative was staying in the crater until dark, another 9 hours, and hoping the Germans didn't find him. Sidorenko chose to stay. Movement was risk. Staying still was risk. He calculated the probabilities and decided that remaining motionless offered slightly better odds of survival. At 11:30, German artillery began shelling Soviet positions. The barrage was lighter than the morning's bombardment, mostly 105 mm howitzer fire. But some shells landed close enough that Sidorenko felt the impacts through the ground. Shrapnel buzzed overhead. One fragment hit the crater's rim 3 feet from his head, spraying him with dirt. At 1300, the artillery stopped. Sidorenko heard German infantry moving forward, advancing under the cover of the barrage. The counterattack was beginning. Without their 5 officers to coordinate the assault, the German attack would be less organized, less effective. Sidorenko had accomplished his mission. Now he just needed to survive long enough to report success. Soviet machine gun fire erupted from defensive positions to the east. The Germans were engaging the main line. Sidorenko heard the distinctive sound of MG-42 machine guns, 1,200 rounds per minute, tearing through air. He heard Soviet Maxim guns answering, slower but steady. The battle was fully engaged now, both sides committed. In the chaos of infantry combat, the search teams would withdraw to support the main assault. Sidorenko would have a window to move, maybe 30 minutes, while German attention was focused elsewhere. He waited 10 minutes, listening to the intensity of gunfire, judging when the fighting reached its peak. At 1340, he decided the moment was right. Sidorenko crawled out of the crater, staying low, moving slowly. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to minimize exposure. He crawled toward the destroyed T-34, using the slight folds in the ground for concealment. 80 yards, moving at 2 yards per minute. It took him 40 minutes to reach the tank. The T-34 had been knocked out weeks ago, maybe months. The turret was blown off, lying on its side 10 feet from the hull. The hull itself was blackened from fire, riddled with penetration holes. But it offered hard cover, something to hide behind while the battle raged. Sidorenko wedged himself into the gap between the hull and the turret, out of sight from German positions. He could see Soviet lines from here, 200 yards east. He could also see the German advance, infantry in squad-sized groups, moving through the same ground he'd just crossed. They were taking casualties from Soviet defensive fire, but they kept coming. Determined attack. At 1520, the German assault stalled. They'd reached Soviet wire obstacles and minefields, slowing their advance. Soviet artillery opened fire, dropping rounds into the stalled German formations. Sidorenko watched through his cracked scope, counting casualties, evaluating the battle. The Germans weren't going to break through. Not today. Not without the coordination those 5 dead officers would have provided. At 1730, the Germans withdrew to their starting positions. The counterattack had failed. Soviet lines held. Casualty estimates would come later, but Sidorenko had seen enough combat to guess. Maybe 200 German casualties, maybe 100 Soviet. A typical day on the Eastern Front. Brutal, grinding, lethal. As darkness fell, Sidorenko began his crawl back to Soviet lines. 200 yards across no man's land, moving in complete darkness, navigating by memory and feel. He reached friendly positions at 21:15, challenged by a Soviet sentry who almost shot him before recognizing the proper password. Captain Volkov met him at the company command post. Volkov looked at Sidorenko's swollen eye, looked at his blood-soaked bandage, looked at his cracked scope. He asked how many targets Sidorenko had eliminated. Sidorenko said 5. Volkov nodded and ordered him to the aid station. The medic who treated Sidorenko's wounds said he'd been lucky. The shrapnel had missed his eye by centimeters. Another quarter inch, and he'd be blind. The medic cleaned the wound, applied fresh bandages, gave Sidorenko morphine for the pain. Sidorenko refused the morphine. He didn't like how it made him think. He needed clarity, not fog. At 2300 hours, Sidorenko sat in the sniper company's dugout, writing in his notebook by candlelight. Entry 288. Oberstleutnant, 300 yards, chest shot, cracked scope compensation, 8 inches right and high, confirmed kill. Entry 289. Hauptmann, 300 yards, chest shot, same compensation, confirmed kill. Entry 290. Unknown rank, 300 yards, head shot, same compensation, confirmed kill. Entry 291. Lieutenant, estimated 280 yards. Running target, lead and compensation applied, confirmed kill. Entry 292. Major or Oberstleutnant, estimated 290 yards. Torso shot, same compensation, confirmed kill. 5 entries. 5 confirmed kills. Total career kills, 292. The next morning, October 4th, an armory technician replaced Sidorenko's cracked scope with a new one. The technician asked how Sidorenko had managed to shoot accurately with damaged optics. Sidorenko explained his compensation method, the geometry of the crack, the calculated offset. The technician said that shouldn't have worked. The refraction through cracked glass was too unpredictable. Sidorenko shrugged. He'd made the calculations, fired the shots, and dropped 5 targets. The mathematics had worked regardless of what the technician thought was possible. Captain Volkov recommended Sidorenko for the Order of the Red Banner. The recommendation cited his success in eliminating 5 high-value targets under adverse conditions with damaged equipment. The Red Army approved the award 3 weeks later. Sidorenko received the medal in a brief ceremony at division headquarters. He wore it on his uniform but never talked about it. The medal didn't matter. The dead officers mattered. The disrupted counterattack mattered. The Soviet soldiers who survived because German coordination collapsed, they mattered. Sidorenko continued fighting through the winter of 1944 and into 1945. His confirmed kill count reached 319 by February 1945. He survived the war, one of the few Soviet snipers to complete multiple years of combat without serious injury. But he never forgot October 3rd, 1944, the day he'd shot 5 German officers with a cracked scope and a damaged eye. The day mathematics and desperation combined to produce results that shouldn't have been possible. The day he proved that a good sniper doesn't need perfect equipment. He needs good calculations and the will to shoot despite impossible circumstances. After the war ended in May 1945, Sidorenko returned to teaching. He went back to his small town outside Moscow, back to the classroom where he'd taught mathematics and physics before the war. He never talked about his service as a sniper. His students didn't know about the 319 confirmed kills, didn't know about the cracked scope, or the 5 dead officers. He was just their mathematics teacher, a quiet man who limped slightly and had a scar across his left eye. The Soviet government tracked down veteran snipers in the late 1940s, documenting their service records for historical purposes. The NKVD interviewed Sidorenko in 1947. They asked detailed questions about his methods, his tactics, his most difficult shots. Sidorenko described the October 3rd engagement. The interviewer asked if he'd been frightened. Sidorenko said fear was irrelevant. He'd had a mission, damaged equipment, and limited time. Fear didn't enter the calculation. The interview notes classified Sidorenko's shooting as improbable but verified. 5 officers confirmed killed, all shots fired through a damaged scope by a partially blinded sniper at 300 yards. The mathematics suggested it shouldn't have worked. The dead officers proved it had. Soviet military academies began teaching Sidorenko's compensation technique in 1948. The curriculum included a section on shooting with damaged optics, using his October 3rd engagement as a case study. Instructors emphasized that equipment failure wasn't an excuse for mission failure. A trained sniper could adapt to almost any circumstance if he understood the underlying physics. The technique spread beyond the Soviet Union. After the Cold War began, Western intelligence agencies obtained Soviet sniper training manuals through various channels. American and British military instructors studied the manuals, looking for tactical insights. They found Sidorenko's method documented in detail: how to calculate offset from cracked optics, how to compensate for parallax errors, how to maintain accuracy despite equipment damage. U.S. Army sniper schools incorporated modified versions of the technique into their curriculum by the 1960s. They called it adaptive zeroing, the ability to recalibrate point of aim when standard zero was compromised. Vietnam-era snipers used adaptive zeroing when their scopes were damaged by moisture, heat, or rough handling in jungle conditions. But Sidorenko himself never knew his technique had spread internationally. He died in 1978 at age 67, still teaching mathematics in the same town where he'd lived before the war. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service as a Red Army soldier, but didn't specify his role as a sniper. His former students remembered him as a patient teacher who could explain complex concepts in simple terms. None of them knew he'd once killed 5 men in 4 minutes with a broken scope. His military records remained classified until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and archives opened. Historians researching Soviet sniper operations discovered his service file, read his kill confirmations, studied his methods. They found his notebook, preserved in a military museum, 319 entries, documenting 319 lives, ended by precise calculation and steady hands. The cracked scope that Sidorenko used on October 3, 1944, was never recovered. The armory technician who replaced it likely discarded the damaged optic, tossed it into a bin with other broken parts destined for salvage or disposal. But Sidorenko's compensation technique survived, taught to generations of snipers who faced equipment failure in combat and needed to keep shooting despite impossible circumstances. Modern military snipers still study the October 3rd engagement. The scenario appears in advanced marksmanship courses. How would you handle a cracked scope in combat? Most students say they'd abort the mission, return for replacement equipment, wait for ideal conditions. Instructors use those responses to teach the central lesson of Sidorenko's experience. Ideal conditions don't exist in war. Equipment fails, soldiers get wounded. Missions can't be postponed. A professional sniper shoots with whatever he has, compensates for whatever's broken, and completes the mission. The 5 German officers killed that morning were never identified by name in Soviet records. Their graves, if they had graves, were never marked. They became statistics, enemy casualties in a war that killed 27 million Soviet citizens and 5 million German soldiers. But their deaths mattered. The counterattack they would have coordinated failed. Soviet soldiers survived because German command and control collapsed at a critical moment. Those surviving Soviet soldiers had families, children, lives after the war. The mathematical ripples extended forward through decades. Sidorenko's damaged eye healed, but he never regained full vision. The shrapnel scar tissue left him partially blind in his left eye. His right eye compensated, adapted, gave him functional vision, but not the perfect sight he'd had before October 3rd. He wore glasses after the war, thick lenses that corrected his remaining vision to near normal. Students who remembered him mentioned the glasses, mentioned how he'd squint at chalkboards, mentioned his slightly awkward gait from an old leg wound. None of them knew those injuries came from a morning when 5 men died because a mathematics teacher understood geometry better than they understood survival. The German army investigated the October 3rd incident. Counterintelligence officers examined the farmhouse, measured angles, calculated probable sniper positions. They determined the shooter had fired from somewhere within a 200-yard radius of the building, probably from a concealed position in no man's land. They increased security protocols for command meetings, prohibited gatherings of multiple officers near windows, implemented stricter light discipline. The changes came too late for the 5 dead officers, but saved others later in the war. German intelligence never learned the Soviet sniper's identity. They recorded the incident as probable elite marksman, extreme skill level, 5 confirmed officer casualties. They added it to a growing list of similar incidents. Soviet snipers eliminating German leadership with precision fire. The pattern disturbed German commanders. They were losing officers faster than they could promote replacements, disrupting command continuity, degrading tactical effectiveness. By late 1944, German soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned to fear Soviet snipers. The fear was well-founded. Soviet sniper schools were graduating 1,000 trained marksmen per year. Many were women. Many were former hunters. All were motivated by 4 years of brutal warfare. They killed officers, NCOs, machine gunners, radio operators, anyone whose death would degrade enemy capability. They operated in pairs, in groups, or alone, depending on mission requirements. And they were ruthlessly effective. Sidorenko was part of that larger effort. One sniper among thousands. One set of confirmed kills among hundreds of thousands. But his October 3rd engagement stood out because it demonstrated something that commanders valued: the ability to complete missions despite catastrophic equipment failure. Wars were won by soldiers who kept fighting when everything went wrong. Sidorenko had proven he was that kind of soldier. After his death in 1978, Sidorenko's family donated his military decorations to a local museum. The Order of the Red Banner, 2 Orders of Glory, the Medal for Courage. They also donated his notebook, the one with 319 entries. Museum curators preserved the notebook in a climate-controlled case, protected from light and moisture. Visitors could see the yellowed pages, see Sidorenko's careful handwriting, see the systematic documentation of death rendered in neat columns. One entry particularly interested historians. October 3, 1944. 5 kills in 4 minutes. The notation included a small sketch showing the offset compensation he'd used, a diagram of the cracked scope and the calculated angles. That sketch became famous in military circles, reproduced in textbooks and training manuals, taught to students who needed to understand how skilled marksmen adapted to damaged equipment. The lesson wasn't about being a good shot. Thousands of soldiers were good shots. The lesson was about being a good thinker under pressure. Sidorenko had faced a problem that should have ended his mission. Cracked optics, wounded eye, no backup equipment. He'd broken the problem into components, calculated solutions, tested his math with human lives, and succeeded. That kind of thinking won battles and wars. Modern snipers train with deliberately damaged equipment to develop similar adaptive skills. Instructors crack scopes, loosen mounts, introduce parallax errors, force students to compensate and maintain accuracy. The exercises are frustrating and difficult. Most students fail initially, but the ones who succeed, the ones who can calculate offset and adjust point of aim, despite damaged optics, those students understand what Sidorenko understood. Equipment is just a tool. The weapon that matters most is the mind. In 1995, 17 years after Sidorenko's death, a Russian military historian named Dmitry Volkov published a comprehensive study of Soviet sniper operations during World War II. The book included a chapter on Sidorenko, focusing specifically on the October 3rd engagement. Volkov had interviewed surviving members of Sidorenko's unit, examined German casualty records captured after the war, and verified the 5 officer deaths. Volkov's research confirmed what Soviet records had documented. All 5 officers were killed within 4 minutes. The German counterattack, launched 2 hours after their deaths, failed to achieve any of its objectives. Soviet lines held. The estimated casualty differential favored Soviet forces significantly compared to previous German attacks in the same sector. Volkov concluded that Sidorenko's mission represented a perfect example of force multiplication. One soldier with 1 rifle had eliminated a command element, disrupting coordination for an entire battalion-sized assault. The mathematics were elegant. 5 bullets, 5 deaths, hundreds of lives saved. The return on investment in sniper training couldn't be calculated in conventional terms. The book became required reading at Russian military academies. Students studied Sidorenko's methods, his calculations, his adaptation to damaged equipment. But more importantly, they studied his mindset. Sidorenko hadn't panicked when his scope cracked. He hadn't abandoned the mission when his eye was damaged. He'd evaluated his remaining capabilities, calculated probabilities, and executed despite overwhelming disadvantages. That mindset became a core component of Russian sniper doctrine. Equipment would fail. Bodies would be damaged. Missions would still need completion. The difference between success and failure wasn't perfect conditions. It was the ability to function when conditions were far from perfect. Western military analysts studied Volkov's book when it was translated into English in 1997. American sniper instructors incorporated Sidorenko's lessons into their curriculum. The specific technique of compensating for cracked optics became part of advanced marksmanship training. But the broader lesson about adaptive thinking under pressure influenced training across all special operations disciplines. In 2003, a U.S. Marine sniper in Iraq faced a similar situation. His scope was damaged by shrapnel during a firefight. He remembered Sidorenko's technique from his training. He calculated the offset, compensated his point of aim, and successfully engaged enemy combatants at 400 yards with damaged optics. His after-action report specifically credited the Soviet sniper's method, a technique that had crossed decades and continents to save American lives in a different war. That's the nature of tactical innovation. Good ideas spread. Effective techniques transcend nationality, ideology, time period. Sidorenko had solved a problem in 1944 that still existed in 2003: how to shoot accurately when your equipment is broken. The solution was mathematics and adaptation. Those principles didn't change regardless of which army applied them. Sidorenko's hometown erected a memorial in 2005, 60 years after the war ended. A simple granite marker in the town square with his name, his dates of service, his confirmed kill count. Local students attended history classes where teachers explained what those numbers meant. 319 enemy soldiers eliminated by a mathematics teacher who understood angles, trajectories, and the physics of death. Some students asked if Sidorenko had felt guilty about the killing. Teachers explained that he'd fought in a war of survival. The German invasion had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Every German soldier Sidorenko killed was one less threat to Soviet lives. The mathematics were brutal, but clear. The alternative to fighting was annihilation. The memorial became a gathering point for Victory Day celebrations each May 9th. Veterans would stand near the marker, remembering the war, remembering comrades who hadn't survived. Some of them had served with Sidorenko, had known him as the quiet sniper who documented every shot in a notebook, who never bragged about his kills, who treated combat like a mathematics problem that needed solving. Those veterans told stories. About the time Sidorenko shot a German officer at 620 yards in heavy wind, compensating for deflection that most snipers couldn't calculate. About the time he spent 3 days lying in a swamp, waiting for one specific target, never moving, never complaining, finally taking the shot and crawling back to Soviet lines through freezing water. About the cracked scope incident that became famous, the 5 officers killed in 4 minutes with damaged equipment and a wounded eye. The stories always emphasized the same qualities: patience, calculation, determination. Sidorenko hadn't been the best shot in the Red Army. Other snipers had higher kill counts, but Sidorenko had been one of the most consistent, one of the most reliable. He completed missions that other snipers couldn't or wouldn't attempt. He adapted to circumstances that would have stopped less determined soldiers. In 2014, 70 years after the October 3rd engagement, Russian military television produced a documentary about Soviet snipers. They devoted 15 minutes to Sidorenko's story, interviewing historians, showing his preserved notebook, recreating the cracked scope shot, using modern filming techniques and ballistic analysis. The documentary included an interview with a modern Russian Army sniper instructor who explained how Sidorenko's technique was still taught. The instructor demonstrated on a training range, deliberately cracking a scope, calculating offset, engaging targets at 300 yards. His shots grouped within 6 inches of point of aim. Not perfect, but combat effective. Exactly what Sidorenko had achieved in 1944, under far worse conditions. The documentary concluded with a simple statement: equipment fails, training endures. The mind is the ultimate weapon. That principle extended beyond sniping, beyond military operations, beyond warfare entirely. Any complex task performed under stress requires adaptation when ideal conditions disappear. The professional doesn't quit when equipment breaks. The professional calculates alternatives, compensates for damage, and completes the mission with whatever resources remain. Sidorenko had exemplified that professionalism, not because he was superhuman or because he had special abilities. He'd succeeded because he understood fundamentals: physics, geometry, ballistics. When his scope cracked, he didn't see catastrophic failure. He saw a physics problem. Cracked glass creates refraction. Refraction creates offset. Offset can be calculated and compensated. Problem solved. The 5 German officers never knew what killed them. They saw an American position, heard German tactical commands, hesitated for a few seconds trying to understand the contradiction. They never heard the shots. Sidorenko's Mosin-Nagant fired 7.62 by 54 millimeter rounds at 2,800 feet per second. At 300 yards, the bullet arrived before the sound. The officers were dead before their brains processed what was happening. That was the nature of sniper warfare. Invisible death from impossible distances, delivered by shooters who calculated trajectories instead of feeling emotions. Sidorenko had killed 319 men without ever seeing most of them as human beings. They were targets, mathematical problems, threats that needed elimination. The emotional distance was necessary for psychological survival. Soldiers who personalized their kills didn't last long in combat. After the war, some veterans struggled with that emotional distance. They'd killed dozens or hundreds of enemy soldiers, then returned to civilian life, where killing was murder and violence was criminal. The psychological transition destroyed some men. They couldn't reconcile their wartime actions with peacetime morality. Sidorenko never seemed troubled by that conflict. His students and neighbors remembered him as calm, steady, unremarkable. He went to work, taught his classes, graded papers, attended community events. The war was something he'd survived, not something that defined him. He'd been a soldier when soldiers were needed. Then he'd been a teacher when teachers were needed. Different roles, different requirements. Perhaps his mathematical mindset protected him. He'd approached combat as applied physics. Bullets followed trajectories determined by velocity, gravity, wind. Targets were eliminated or missed based on calculations. Success or failure depended on accurate math, not moral judgment. That framework might have insulated him from the psychological trauma that affected soldiers who saw war in more personal terms. Or perhaps he simply compartmentalized effectively. Wartime killing stayed in the wartime compartment. Peacetime teaching stayed in the peacetime compartment. The two didn't mix. Many veterans managed similar separations. They preserved their sanity by keeping different aspects of their lives isolated from each other. Whatever his method, Sidorenko survived both the war and the peace. He lived quietly for 33 years after the fighting ended, raised a family, taught hundreds of students, never drew attention to his military service. His wartime decorations stayed in a drawer. His notebook stayed in a closet. He didn't attend veterans' gatherings or give interviews or participate in ceremonies. Only after his death did the full scope of his service become public knowledge. His family donated his records to the museum. Historians researched his confirmed kills. Military instructors taught his techniques. The quiet mathematics teacher became a case study in adaptive thinking under combat stress. The irony wasn't lost on military historians. Sidorenko had been famous among Soviet snipers during the war. His methods were taught at sniper schools. His confirmed kill count was documented and verified, but he'd deliberately avoided post-war fame. He'd returned to obscurity, choosing anonymity over recognition. That choice reflected something fundamental about effective warriors. Many of the most capable soldiers don't seek glory. They do their jobs, survive if possible, then return to normal life without fanfare. The culture lionizes warriors who embrace their combat identities. But some of the best fighters are men and women who view warfare as necessary work, not personal identity. Sidorenko had been that kind of soldier. He'd killed 319 enemy combatants because his country needed enemy combatants killed. When the war ended and the need disappeared, he stopped killing and resumed teaching. Simple transition. No existential crisis. No need for validation or recognition. He'd been a sniper when sniping was required. Then he'd been a teacher when teaching was his job. The October 3rd engagement remained his most analyzed mission. The combination of damaged equipment, personal injury, high-value targets, and perfect execution created a case study that transcended normal tactical analysis. Military instructors taught it not because it was replicable, but because it demonstrated mental discipline under conditions that should have caused mission failure. The lessons extended beyond compensation for cracked optics. The real lesson was about maintaining cognitive function when circumstances were catastrophic. Sidorenko's scope was cracked. His eye was damaged. His spotter was dead. German search teams were hunting him. Any one of those factors could have justified aborting the mission. But Sidorenko had evaluated each factor mathematically. Cracked scope meant calculating offset. Damaged eye meant reduced depth perception. Dead spotter meant no backup. German search teams meant time pressure. None of those factors made the mission impossible. They just made it harder. And harder wasn't the same as impossible. That distinction mattered in every high-stress profession. Doctors performed surgery with inadequate equipment. Engineers designed solutions with insufficient resources. Pilots landed damaged aircraft. In every case, professionals faced the same choice: quit because conditions weren't ideal, or adapt and complete the mission with whatever was available. Sidorenko had adapted. He'd calculated his offset, compensated his aim, shot 5 targets in 4 minutes, and changed the outcome of a battle. Then he'd crawled back to Soviet lines, documented his kills in his notebook, and prepared for the next mission. No drama, no heroic narrative, just mathematics and determination applied to the problem of keeping Soviet soldiers alive by killing German officers. The work was brutal, necessary, and ultimately successful. That was enough.